Life has a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. One moment, you're a man with a purpose, a plan, and a future. The next, you're standing at the edge of the life you thought was yours, realizing it was never real to begin with. I had spent over 30 years in the Marine Corps, serving my country with everything I had. Combat zones, deployments, years spent away from home. All of it was for something greater than myself. But through it all, I held on to one thing. The thought of coming home to Emily, my wife. The woman I loved more than anything. Retirement was supposed to be my fresh start. No more deployments, no more months spent away, just me, Emily, and the life we had built together. I had envisioned quiet mornings fishing on the lake, evenings by the fire, and finally making up for all the lost time. But life had other plans. As my plane landed in Spokane, I was filled with an uneasy anticipation. I had told Emily I'd be home today. I expected her to be waiting for me at the airport, the way she always had after my deployments. But as I stepped off the plane and into the arrival terminal, scanning the crowd, she wasn't there. At first, I told myself she must be running late. Traffic, maybe. I pulled out my phone and called her. No answer. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. A strange feeling settled in my gut. Emily had never missed a homecoming before. Even when I told her she didn't have to pick me up, she always insisted. It's tradition, she would say. I want to be the first one to welcome you home. But today, there was no tradition. After waiting for nearly an hour, I gave up and grabbed a cab. The ride back to Coeur d'Alene was long and quiet, my mind running through scenarios, each one worse than the last. Maybe she had a work emergency. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe I was making excuses for something I didn't want to admit. When we pulled into the driveway of our house, the first thing I noticed was that her car wasn't there. That was the moment I knew. I climbed out of the cab, feeling like I was moving through a dream. No, a nightmare. The kind where you know what's coming but can't stop it. My hands trembled as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Everything was in its place, yet something felt off. Then I saw it. A suitcase. Half-packed. Sitting at the foot of our bed. A lump formed in my throat as I walked closer, my boots heavy against the wooden floor. Next to the suitcase, neatly folded, was a shirt. A man's shirt. But it wasn't mine. The breath left my lungs as I reached down, picked it up, and felt the fabric between my fingers. It smelled of cologne, a scent I didn't recognize. And that's when I saw it. On the nightstand, next to Emily's perfume, lay a wristwatch. A man's watch. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it. The room spun around me, and my body went numb. She wouldn't. She couldn't. Emily was my wife. The woman who had written me letters while I was overseas. The woman who had sent me care packages filled with little notes that said things like, "Come home safe to me." The woman who had promised, in front of God and everyone we knew, to be faithful. I wanted to believe there was some other explanation. Maybe it was a relative's. Maybe she had borrowed it from someone. Maybe. But no. Because as I looked around, I started seeing all the other little signs I had ignored for too long. The new perfume. The way she had been distant in our recent calls. The way she had stopped saying, "I love you" first. I had been blind. A noise from outside snapped me back to reality. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I turned slowly, still holding the watch, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The front door creaked open. Footsteps. Then her voice. "Honey, I didn't expect you so." She stopped mid-sentence. I lifted my gaze to meet hers. Her face went pale. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, unasked questions, and the crushing weight of the truth. I placed the watch back on the nightstand with careful precision. Then, without a word, I walked past her, my movements slow, deliberate. She turned as I passed, her mouth opening slightly, as if she wanted to explain, to justify, to deny. But I didn't give her the chance. I stepped out the front door, down the steps, and into the cool evening air. She had broken my trust, and she thought I would fight for her. Thought I would beg, demand answers, try to salvage what was left. She was wrong. I was done. The moment I stepped out of that house, something inside me snapped. I had spent decades being the man who always showed up, the man who gave everything to the people he loved. I fought wars, carried burdens, and held my family together through the hardest years. And for what? For this? For a half-packed suitcase and another man's watch on my nightstand? No. I wasn't going to be that guy. The one who begs, who pleads, who lets himself be humiliated for the sake of keeping a broken marriage intact. I wasn't going to give Emily the satisfaction of watching me unravel. I was done being predictable. I walked to my truck, my hands steady now, the initial shock burning away into something else, something colder, something sharper. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life beneath me, and pulled out of the driveway without looking back. I didn't go far. I parked a few blocks away, cutting the engine and sitting in silence. My head rested against the steering wheel as I took deep, slow breaths. The house I had built, the life I had spent years fighting for, it was all crumbling, but I refused to be buried beneath it. Not this time. I pulled out my phone. I wasn't sure why, maybe out of habit, maybe out of some last flicker of disbelief that she had done this to me. My fingers hovered over her number, but I didn't call. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I let go. I put the phone down, leaned back in my seat, and stared at the darkened sky above. Emily had made her choice. Now it was my turn. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove to an old friend's cabin outside town, deep in the woods where no one would bother me. I needed time, space, a chance to breathe without the stench of betrayal choking me. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel nothing. The next morning, I returned home. Emily was in the kitchen when I walked in. The smell of coffee filled the air, and for a brief moment, it felt normal, like any other morning. But then she saw me. Her eyes flickered with something, relief, guilt, fear. I didn't give her the reaction she was expecting. Morning, I said, my voice even emotionless. She hesitated. You didn't come home last night. I shrugged. Didn't feel like it. A pause. She waited, like she thought I'd say more. I didn't. Instead, I walked past her, poured myself a cup of coffee, and took a slow sip. She shifted uncomfortably. Where did you go? I looked at her then, really looked at her. The woman I had loved for over 3 decades. The woman I had sacrificed for. The woman I had trusted. I saw the way she tensed under my gaze, the way her fingers curled slightly around her coffee mug. I didn't answer her question. Instead, I smiled, just a small, empty curve of my lips, and said, you should probably finish packing. Emily flinched. For the first time, the reality of what was happening seemed to sink in for her. She had expected a fight, tears, rage, anything but this, anything but indifference. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. I left my coffee on the counter and walked away. The days that followed were different. I didn't confront her. I didn't argue. I didn't demand an explanation. I simply stopped caring. Or at least, I made her believe I had. The change was subtle at first. I stopped texting her during the day. Stopped asking how her morning was. Stopped noticing when she got home late. She thought she had broken me. She thought I would chase her, that I would fight for her, that I would beg. Instead, I made myself absent in ways that mattered. The small gestures she had once taken for granted. The way I used to warm her car in the winter. The way I used to bring her coffee in bed on Sundays. The way I used to reach for her hand absent-mindedly as we watched TV. All of it stopped. At first, she didn't react. Maybe she was relieved. Maybe she thought she had won. But then, little by little, I saw it. The first cracks in her confidence. She started texting me first, little things like, hey, what time will you be home? I took hours to respond. Sometimes I didn't respond at all. She started lingering in the kitchen when I was making dinner, as if waiting for me to engage in conversation like I used to. I didn't. She would reach for my arm absent-mindedly, just a small touch, like she was testing the waters. I would shift away. At night, when she climbed into bed beside me, she would hesitate. The first few nights, she acted as if nothing had changed, turning her back to me like she always did. But then, one night, she turned toward me instead. I felt her eyes on me in the dark. I didn't move. Eventually, she let out a soft sigh and turned away again. She had expected fireworks. She had expected a confrontation, a messy explosion of emotions, the kind that would let her frame herself as the victim, as the one who was being pushed away. She didn't know what to do with my silence. And that's when I knew. She was starting to feel it. The emptiness. The loss. She was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, she had made a mistake. But it was already too late. Emily always believed she was in control. For years, she had been the center of my universe, the gravity that held everything together. Every decision, every sacrifice I made, it was all for her, for our marriage, for the life we built. She had learned to count on that, to count on me. She thought no matter what she did, no matter how far she strayed, I would always be there, waiting, willing to patch things up. But I wasn't that man anymore, and it terrified her. At first, she told herself it was nothing. She brushed it off when I stopped reaching for her hand. Convinced herself it was just a phase when I no longer greeted her with the warmth she was used to. She even seemed relieved when I didn't bombard her with questions about where she had been or who she had been with. But then, the little things started to unravel her confidence. I stopped reacting. She would put on her nicest dress, the one she knew I always loved, and linger by the mirror, waiting for me to say something. I would glance at her once, nod absently, and go back to whatever I was doing. She would mention coworkers' names in passing, trying to gauge my reaction, waiting for the jealousy, the interrogation. Instead, I would simply nod, as if I barely heard her. She tried to use old habits to bait me. One evening, she set the table for dinner, something she hadn't done in years. She cooked one of my favorite meals, a meal she always knew would put me in a good mood. She served my plate, sat across from me, and watched, waiting for me to say something. I ate in silence. The tension in the room grew thick. She kept glancing at me, her grip tightening on her fork. "How was your day?" she finally asked. I looked up at her, swallowing my bite. "Fine." A pause. She gave a small, forced laugh. "That's all." I shrugged. Not much to say. Another beat of silence. I saw the way her lips pressed together, how her fingers tapped against the table. She was unraveling, slowly, piece by piece. Good. The nights were the worst for her. She was used to me wrapping an arm around her, pulling her close. Even when we argued, even after bad days, I had always been the one to reach for her first. She had counted on my presence, my touch, my warmth. Now, the space between us and bed felt like an ocean. I would lie there, my breathing even, while she twisted and turned beside me. Sometimes, I felt her shift closer, as if testing the distance. Other times, I felt her let out soft sighs, waiting, hoping I would react. I never did. One night, she finally broke. I was half asleep when I felt her fingers brush my arm. A hesitant, feather-light touch, one she could easily take back if I reacted the wrong way. I didn't move. Then, softly, she whispered, "Are you awake?" I kept my breathing steady, slow, deep. I didn't answer. She exhaled shakily, and after a few minutes, she turned away. But I knew she didn't sleep that night. The phone calls started next. At first, they were casual. She would call me during the day, just a quick, "Hey, how's your day going?" I kept my answers short. "Fine. Busy. Nothing new." Then she started texting more. "Miss you. Thinking about you." It was laughable. Months ago, when I had still been the same devoted husband she had taken for granted, I would have killed for those messages. I would have dropped everything to answer her calls, to remind her I was thinking about her, too. Now, I barely looked at my phone when it buzzed. She called me twice in one day. I let it ring. When I finally answered that evening, her voice was laced with something I hadn't heard from her in years, uncertainty. "Hey," she said, forcing a lightness into her tone. "Did you see my calls?" "Yeah." A pause. "And?" I took a sip of my drink, letting the silence stretch. "And what?" "Well, I don't know. I wanted to hear your voice." That was new. Emily never used to say things like that. She had always been confident, in control. She had always assumed I would be there, no matter what. Now, she was chasing. I smiled to myself. "Just been busy," I said finally, my tone neutral. She hesitated. "Busy with what?" I let out a soft chuckle. "Since when do you care?" That hit her. I could hear it in the way her breath caught, in the way the easy confidence in her voice cracked just slightly. "I've always cared," she said weakly. We both knew that was a lie. Her anxiety turned to irritation. When I started going out more, staying late at the gym or grabbing drinks with old friends, she noticed. She made little comments, casual jabs disguised as jokes. "Didn't realize you were such a social butterfly now. You're never home anymore. You didn't used to spend so much time on your phone." I just smirked and shrugged. Guess things change. Her frustration grew. One evening, as I was getting ready to head out, she finally cracked. "Are you seeing someone?" she blurted out. I froze, glancing at her through the mirror as I adjusted my shirt. That was it. That was the real fear behind all of this. She had assumed I would always be there, waiting, devoted. But now, she wasn't so sure. I turned slowly, meeting her gaze. Why? Would it bother you? Her lips parted slightly. She wasn't expecting that. She swallowed, forcing a laugh, but I saw the way her hands clenched at her sides. Of course not. I just think it's funny. You're acting different, that's all. I stepped toward her, slow, deliberate, stopping just inches away. And what if I am? I asked, my voice low. I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes, the way she searched my face for reassurance, for a denial that never came. She had wanted me to fight for her. Now, she was the one fighting for me. And that was only the beginning of her downfall. Emily's irritation didn't last long. It wasn't real anger, just the kind of frustration that came when things didn't go her way, when her usual tactics didn't work. But frustration was a temporary emotion. Desperation, though, that was something else entirely. And that's where she was headed. She wasn't used to feeling uncertain. For years, she had built her world on the assumption that I would always be there, no matter what. That I was reliable, dependable, predictable. She thought I was hers forever. But now, something had shifted. She could feel it in the silence between us, in the space I no longer tried to close. In the way I didn't seek her out, didn't ask where she had been, didn't try to win her back. And it scared her. At first, she tried to ignore it. She told herself that I was sulking, punishing her with my coldness. That I just needed time to come around, to return to the man I used to be. But then days turned into weeks. And I didn't come around. The first time she truly cracked was a Sunday night. I was in the garage, working on my truck, when I heard the door creak open behind me. Emily rarely came into the garage. It was my space, and she had never been interested in what I did there. But now, she hesitated in the doorway, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. I kept working, letting her stand there in silence. Finally, she spoke. "You've been distant," she said softly. I didn't look up. "Yeah." She took a few steps closer. "I don't like it." I tightened a bolt on the engine, wiping my hands on a rag. "Not much I can do about that." She flinched. "Why are you acting like this?" I turned then, finally meeting her eyes. "Like what?" She swallowed. "Like you don't care." I let out a breath, shaking my head with a small, humorless chuckle. "Emily, I think you're finally getting it." That hit her hard. I could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, in the way her fingers gripped the hem of her sweater. She trailed off, her voice softer now. "I miss how things used to be." I stared at her for a long moment, letting her words settle between us. Then I tossed the rag aside and stepped past her, heading toward the house. I didn't say a word, because there was nothing left to say. After that, she stopped pretending nothing was wrong. Her calls became more frequent, her texts more persistent. At first, it was subtle, a lingering touch, a soft smile, an attempt to weave her way back into my life with small, familiar gestures. Then, when that didn't work, she started making excuses to be around me. She suddenly wanted to watch the shows I liked, sit next to me on the couch, accidentally brush against me when she passed by. One night, she made dinner, something she hadn't done in months, maybe even longer. She set the table carefully, lighting a candle as if that would make me forget everything. When I walked in and saw her standing there, waiting, she smiled. I thought we could eat together. I looked at the food, then back at her. I already ate. Her face fell, just slightly, but she quickly covered it with another forced smile. "Oh, well, maybe tomorrow." I didn't answer. I just walked past her, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and headed to the porch. She didn't follow me. She just stood there, staring at the table she had set for two. Then the breakdown started. She wasn't subtle anymore. One night, I found her in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, her breathing unsteady. When I walked past, she turned suddenly, her eyes glossy. "Do you even love me anymore?" she asked, her voice cracking. I froze for half a second before exhaling slowly. "Do you?" she pressed, stepping closer. "Because I feel like I don't even know you anymore." I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. "Now you know how I felt." She inhaled sharply, like I had just struck her. "That's not fair." I tilted my head slightly. "Isn't it?" She blinked rapidly, shaking her head. "I don't know what's happening to us." I let out a short laugh. "I do." She looked up at me, desperate now. "Then fix it." That was when I realized she still didn't get it. She still thought there was a way back. That I was punishing her. that this was just another fight we could somehow come back from. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You want me to fix this? She nodded quickly, hope flickering in her eyes. I leaned in slightly, watching that hope grow. Then I whispered, you broke it, and walked away. Her panic spiraled after that. I would catch her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking. Lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her breath unsteady. She started calling my friends, asking if I had been talking to anyone. She asked me outright if I had met someone else. Does it matter? I had replied, smirking slightly. Her lip trembled. Yes. I just shrugged. She had spent so much time assuming I would never leave, that I would always be the one chasing, the one clinging. Now, for the first time, she was the one chasing me. But it was too late. She was drowning in the emptiness she had created, and I wasn't going to save her. She had lost me, and she knew it. Emily had always been the kind of woman who believed she was in control. She manipulated situations without making it obvious, steered conversations where she wanted them to go, and played her emotions like carefully chosen cards in a poker game. But now, she was losing, and she knew it. Her attempts to fix things became more desperate, more erratic. She started waking up earlier than me, making breakfast, something she hadn't done in years. She started dressing nicer, even when she wasn't going anywhere. I'd come home to find her in a dress, makeup done, pretending to read a book like she hadn't been sitting there, waiting for me to walk in. She started reminiscing out loud. Remember our trip to the coast? She'd say, her voice soft, forcing a smile. That little seafood place we found. I missed that. I wouldn't respond. I'd just sip my drink, flipping through the channels. She tried touching me more. A hand on my arm. A playful shove when she forced out a laugh. It didn't work. She tried cooking, cleaning, making home feel warm again. It didn't work. She tried guilt. You're punishing me, she accused one night, her voice breaking. You want me to suffer. I turned to her slowly, my expression calm, unreadable. No, Emily. You did that to yourself. She flinched, as if the truth physically hurt. Then, finally, she tried begging. And that's when I knew she was broken. It happened late one night. I was sitting on the porch, drinking a beer, listening to the crickets in the distance. The night was cool, the kind that usually calmed me, made me feel grounded. But then I heard the door creak open behind me. Emily stepped outside, wrapped in one of my old sweatshirts. It hung off her frame, her arms crossed over her chest, as if she were bracing for something painful. She walked over slowly, hesitating before sitting beside me. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then, her voice, small, fragile, so unlike the confident woman I had once known. Tell me how to fix this. I took another sip of my beer, staring at the dark horizon. You can't. Her breath hitched, but I didn't turn to look at her. She swallowed hard. I don't want to lose you. I let out a quiet, bitter laugh. You already did. That broke her. I could hear it in the way she sucked in a sharp breath, in the way her hands trembled slightly. She reached for me then, fingers closing around my wrist, not forcefully, but pleadingly. Please, she whispered. I don't want this to end. I finally turned to look at her. Tears lined her eyes, her lips parted slightly, her breathing uneven. She was unraveling, and she deserved every second of it. I leaned forward, slow, deliberate, just close enough so she could see the cold finality in my eyes. You thought I would beg, I murmured. You thought I would fight for you. You thought I would chase you, didn't you? She blinked rapidly, fresh tears slipping down her cheeks. I pulled my wrist from her grip. You were wrong. And with that, I stood, leaving her alone on the porch, shaking, broken. I had finally won, and she finally understood that she had lost. Emily was drowning, but she refused to let go. She had tried everything: kindness, nostalgia, seduction, guilt. None of it worked. My silence had become a mirror, forcing her to face what she had done, and the reflection was eating her alive. She started lingering in rooms she had no reason to be in, pretending to read a book in the chair near me, scrolling through her phone, but never actually typing anything. At night, I heard her breathing change, the restless shifting of sheets, the way she exhaled sharply when she thought I was asleep. The desperation settled into her skin like a sickness. She wasn't eating as much. Her morning coffee sat untouched. Dark circles formed under her eyes. One night, I found her in the kitchen, standing in front of the open fridge, staring blankly inside, as if she had forgotten why she was there. When she finally shut the door, her movements were slow, sluggish. She was unraveling from the inside out. But it wasn't my problem anymore. The final attempt came suddenly. It was late, the house was quiet, and I was in the garage, working on my truck. The air smelled of oil and metal, grounding me in something real, something that made sense. Then I heard her footsteps. Soft, hesitant. She stood in the doorway for a long time before speaking. I can't do this anymore. I didn't turn around. The wrench in my hand tightened, the bolt turning steadily as I continued my work. Her voice wavered. I don't know how to live like this. A pause. I heard the shift of fabric, the uneven breath she took before she forced herself to continue. I know I hurt you, she whispered. I know I tightened the last bolt, set the wrench down, wiped my hands on a rag. Still, I didn't turn. She was waiting for me to break the silence. I didn't. She let out a shaky breath, as if steeling herself for something. Then she stepped forward, closing the space between us. Her hands hesitated before she reached for my arm, fingers barely grazing my skin. The touch was light, fragile, a ghost of what it once was. She wasn't trying to seduce me anymore. This wasn't a game. This was a woman at the edge of a cliff, grasping for anything to hold on to. But I wasn't going to save her. I let her fingers rest there for a moment before I pulled my arm away, slow and deliberate. Her breath caught. Then I finally turned, meeting her gaze. Tears welled in her eyes, but I saw it. The final, sinking realization that there was no way back. I picked up my tools, walked past her without a word, and left her standing there, alone in the cold, empty garage. She had lost me. For good. The end came quietly. No screaming, no dramatic confrontations. Just the slow, inevitable collapse of something that had already been dead for a long time. Emily had fought, but she had lost. She knew it now. The house felt different in those final days. The air between us was heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken words. She moved through the rooms carefully, as if afraid of disturbing something fragile. She stopped trying. No more sudden touches. No more desperate glances. No more late-night whispers or forced smiles. She finally understood. I had let go, and I wasn't coming back. The night before she left, I found her in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap. Her suitcase was packed this time. No hesitation, no half-folded clothes spilling onto the floor. Just one bag, zipped and ready. She wasn't crying. She had done enough of that already. I stood in the doorway, watching her. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, slowly, she lifted her head and met my eyes. There was no fight left in them. No expectation. Just quiet, hollow acceptance. She opened her mouth slightly, as if searching for something to say. A final plea, a final justification, some last thread of hope to cling to. But there was nothing left to be said. And she knew it. Her lips pressed together. Her fingers tightened over the suitcase handle. I didn't move as she stood. Didn't move as she walked past me, her steps slow, deliberate. Didn't move as the front door opened, as she hesitated just slightly before stepping out into the cold evening air. The door clicked shut behind her. And just like that, she was gone. I didn't watch her drive away. I didn't follow, didn't check my phone for messages that would never come. I simply stood there, staring at the empty space where she had been. Then, finally, I exhaled. Not in relief. Not in victory. But in something quieter. Something final. For the first time in a long time, I felt weightless. Not broken. Not angry. Just free.